Hi y'all, and welcome to our first tutorial for Music 503 Online Edition. Today we're looking at week 9, which is two voices and mixed values, and one of the best ways of getting into that is by doing canons. And so today we're going to do a tutorial that teaches us how to use Montanos' rules to create both a canon in first species, and then how we can elaborate that canon in first species into something that is in mixed values in both voices. So there will be two videos. The first one will be getting the canon down in first species and appending a cadence to it. And the second one is going to be about how we can flesh all of that out into something decidedly more interesting. So without further ado, let's get started. Part 1, First Species. Just a quick revision of the rules that Montanos sets out if we're going to imitate at the fifth above, which is my choice to do in this particular case. That means the guide voice is going to be the lower voice and the consequent voice is going to be the one that follows above it. So allowable melodic intervals into this circumstance are up a third, up a fifth, down a fourth, or down a second, and they're different if your guide voice is the top voice, remember. So these are the ones, these are what we can use. So we're a little bit restricted. We can't kind of write anything. However, those restrictions will be lifted once we have the framework in place and we start fleshing it out in the next video. So there's a few steps to follow. Let's go through those quickly. So this is how it's a framework that I think you will find useful. Start by writing the guide voice for several measures in first species. You'll generally be given a number of measures that your guide voice, or whole notes that your guide voice should last. No cadence as of yet, just write it out to a certain point. Then, once you've got that down, you write the consequent voice in first species. So that's fairly easy. You just take the guide voice, put it up a fifth, and move it over by a whole note. Finally, well, not finally, semi-finally, you make a cadence in the guide voice using fourth species, and then finally now, you break the canon in the consequent voice and complete the cadence, because you can't get to a cadence following strict canonic procedures. It's just not possible. Okay, so let's start by taking a look at the guide voice. So here, just as a reminder, there are two factors that we consider when we're looking at canons. What is the pitch interval, or PI? So in this case, it's going to be the fifth. And what is the time interval, TI, or the distance between the beginnings of both voices? So in this case, one whole note. So the guide voice starts, and then the consequent voice is going to start in measure 2 when we finally put it in. So here I have 9 measures of the guide. Let's give it a listen. I decided to use clarinet on this because I thought it was the closest thing I could get on Note Performer to a crumb horn, and it was way better than the choral voices. So let's analyze this a little bit just to see what's going on. Since we talked about motivic repetition and motivic variation in the last couple of weeks, I thought I would incorporate a motive into my own work here. So we can see the motive right here. Re, fa, mi, re. And then it's followed by that same motive, but in retrograde inversion. So here, la, sol, fa, la. So that was just me being maybe too clever for my own good. All right, you'll notice that here we have what would normally be faux pas in roll land, but remember that in Montanos' rules we relax certain things because it would make writing the canon somewhat impossible. So one of the things that we relax is rules about leaps, but only in first species. That once we get into mixed values, you can't have these incorrect leaps. However, I would like to point out that in this particular case, it is correct because the two leaps are okay because of the pyramid rule. The major third, the larger of the two intervals being on the bottom, and the minor third, the smaller of the two being on top. All right, so now that we've got our guide voice down, time to write the consequent voice. So here I just put it up a fifth and moved it over by a measure. Let's give it a listen. You'll note the dotted line there on the screen, and that dotted line is to indicate that at some point we should be arriving at a cadence fairly soon. You'll also notice here that we have a unison, which normally on a downbeat is incorrect, but given the strictness of the rules, unisons on downbeats will be allowed. And like I said, we need to start thinking about a cadence as of here. So how are we going to get there? There's a formula for that. And so let's move on and figure out what it is. So number 3, make a cadence in the guide voice in fourth species. So Montanos has a specific formula for this, and it is, so you'll note the cadence there, the best way to make a cadence in the guide is to step down to a scale degree 5 half note, leap up to a fourth scale degree whole note to prepare this the suspension. I don't know what that I is doing there, but don't worry. Oh, scale degree 1, pardon me. To prepare the suspension, resolve the suspension in the next measure to the leading tone, et voilà, c'est accompli. So so here is the first half of our cadence. So now let's listen. So all that's left for us to do now is to break the canon and complete the cadence in the consequent voice. So you'll note that basically from the dotted line, the canon, well, the G is the last note of the consequent voice that's actually following the canon, after which point it breaks, and we move on. So here we go. Oh, proper cadence, just so that you can see that nice and clearly. Here's the recording. All right, so a couple of things that we should think about before we end this segment of our tutorial. If you take a quick look at all of the intervals, they mostly end up being sixths and thirds. There are no fifths, which Montanos' rules basically prevent from happening, but fifths can certainly occur when we get into fifths and octaves, pardon me, can occur when we get into the mixed values situation as we start moving stuff around. You'll also notice that the top voice doesn't really get to its modal octave. The bottom voice does, but the consequent does not. So that's something that we're going to have to think about in terms of being able to make a sensible counterpoint. And obviously we're going to need to jazz things up a little bit in a very 16th century kind of way. So with that being said, stay tuned for part 2. I'll see you there. Ciao.